following is a presentation of the Fairfax Network.
Hello, and welcome to this after-school special with author Lucinda Roy. Lucinda Roy is an English professor at Virginia Tech and author of Lady Moses. Lady Moses is a semi-autobiographical tale of a young Anglo-African woman coming to terms with her own identity and her love for family and friends. Lady Moses was followed by critically acclaimed Hotel Alleluia. And like Lady Moses, this book compels readers to explore themes of race, bloodlines, and personal commitments. Lucinda Roy is also a poet, painter, teacher, mother, and wife. Lucinda, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Great having you here. Yeah.
Thank you.
And with us in the studio, we have a combination of teachers, students, librarians, and welcome everybody. Thanks for being here. And my name is Lynn Okerson, and I'll be facilitating the program this afternoon. And I'm going to go ahead and ask the first question. We're just going to dive right in. Lucinda, recently in the Washington Post, you were interviewed, and you were discussing the differences between writing poetry and narrative. And you came up with an eloquent response, and I'd like to read it, and if you would elaborate on that. You said, and I quote, "As a poet, you can sort of stand in the middle of a theater and scream, but dealing with narrative is rather like having to move furniture around."
You know, that really is true. That quote is so appropriate, I think. And the reason why I said it, I think, is because with poetry, it's a very emotional experience. You tend to stand in a room by yourself and you talk about your emotions. It's often very subjective. With fiction, on the other hand, you have to be able to juggle lots of different things. It's rather like being a trapeze artist and a juggler at the same time and defying gravity. And you have to make sure that you can move all the characters around very easily. You have to remember where they stood, where they're going, and you have to be able to get them from A to B. And so the craft of writing fiction is actually quite complicated and very difficult. You really do have to be a juggler. Whereas with poetry, I think you do have to be aware of the craft, but you also have to feel a great deal. That's why so many poets are very depressed, you know, because you feel a great deal.
Well, you are a master at moving furniture around and
Thank you.
thoughts and images.
Thank you.
And let's get the studio audience involved here. Becky, you have a question for Lucinda?
Hi, Mrs. Roy. I was wondering, what propelled you to be a writer, and why did you write Lady Moses?
You know, I wrote Lady Moses because the novel just wouldn't keep quiet. There's a character in there called Jacinta Louise Buttercup Moses, who is nothing like me, Lucinda, Helena, Joseph, and Veronica Roy. Totally different, but the names are a little bit similar. But she would keep coming to me late at night and she'd say, write me, write me. And I'd say, you know, I'm tired, it's midnight. I was Associate Dean in Arts and Sciences at Virginia Tech at the time, and I didn't have time to write a novel. I'd written poetry, and that's what I thought I'd do, but she really wanted me to tell her story. And when you have a novel to write, anybody who's tried to do it, you write it because it makes you write it. You don't stand up one day and say, I'm going to write a novel. The novel, in a sense, writes you because the characters won't be quiet. And I really think that that's what propelled me to do it.
That's wonderful. Lori, how about you? I see you have a question.
Yes, Lucinda, how did you develop your characters and keep track of the events?
Oh, you know, that was so hard. Developing the characters wasn't too difficult, but keeping track of the events. I'm a forgetful person anyway. I've been known to call my son the name of the dog, that kind of thing, because I'll forget things. And so trying to make sure that I remember everything in order is tough for me. And so what I'd have to do to be as organized as possible is sit down every single day. And anyone who's writing fiction, I really recommend that. You discipline yourself. It's a kind of military activity in some ways. You sit down, you make yourself write, you make yourself read over and review what you've written before, and then you can approach it in a fairly organized way. But when you have a large novel, and the one I'm working on now, for example, is well over 500 pages, it's very tough to keep everything in order. So I also make a really good outline, and I make one on the computer and one by hand because they feel different to me. And I'll look at both of those and see where I am and try and develop from there.
Boy, discipline, that's very important.
It's
you know.
hard for me.
And you don't have the luxury of being a full-time author, so.
No, I really don't. I teach creative writing at Virginia Tech. I'm a professor, and I've also just been made director of creative writing there. So we're trying to build some pretty good programs, we hope. And yeah, it's very busy, but I find I can write very well between midnight and 2 in the morning, that I'm particularly productive then, and then I can go to sleep, and then I get up pretty early, and it's nice because you float through the day after that. You don't even know what's really going on, which is always wise for a writer.
Karen, you have a question?
I do. There's some recurring imagery in Lady Moses. You have fish, water, blood, and this goes throughout England and America and Africa. Is that intentional, and what does it mean?
You know, that's such a good question about whether or not it's intentional. When I was writing it in the beginning, I don't think it was intentional. I think I had fish's hands. I call them fish's hands in the carpet in Lady Moses, just because that was the shape of the paisley pattern of the carpet. But later on, because of what happens in the story, the whole notion of what a fish is and what fish's hands may be becomes very important. But I didn't sit down and say, I'm going to make these images so that they resonate throughout the novel. I think if you do that, it's a mistake. Let me give you another example. I wrote a poem called Carousel about my father, and it's full of circles. And I didn't realize it was full of circles till I got to the end. I thought I'd just remembered the one memory I had of him, because he died when I was 5, was riding on a carousel. And later on I realized there was the round hole of the angel's trumpet in the poem, and there was the round circles of our breath, because we couldn't afford to have heating in our house. And all those cyclical things came back in the novel, but I didn't know that that was going to happen when I first wrote it.
Lucinda, you speak of those images, and I'm compelled to comment on the cover of the hummingbirds is your painting, and it is absolutely exquisite. Would you talk about how you brought those elements together, and did this inspire you to use it as a cover, or did you already have that image? Or
you know, the funny thing is, Lynn, I don't remember anymore what came first, the book or the cover. Well, there's a poem about the cover of the hummingbirds, and it's called Suffering the Sea Change, Not Venus But Rising. And it's about the image that's on the front of the cover with this woman rising from the sea and the wings that appear, and she's half fish and half bird, and you don't quite know what she is. I think that my painting and my poetry in particular are so fused that it's hard to even tell the difference between the two. But the one thing I do know about painting is that it allows me a wordless space in which to work. Some people will really understand what I mean by that. Language, especially if you're an English professor, you have to be able to use it fairly well, very often. What's nice about the canvas is that it's silent. So I can communicate without any words at all, and I feel so refreshed because of it. It's like being liberated.
And the fish is repetitive. Why the fish?
I think, you know, a fish, of course, is an ancient symbol for all kinds of things. I think in my writing, a fish always, to some extent, stands for transformation, how we live in different elements, how we are able to survive in those things. And I think you'll see that throughout my work.
Sue, let's go to your question.
Your work is very strongly about women and race, not necessarily about feminism and racism. Could you comment in particular on the role of the theme of race in your novels?
Mm-hmm. Race is central to my novels. I think in part because I'm biracial. My mother was a white English woman. My father was a Jamaican man. He was an artist and a novelist and a sculptor. My mother was an actress, and they met when she modeled for him. So there was a coming together in my house of black and white. At the time, I mean, I was born in 1955. I know I don't look as I was, but I was. And in 1955, it was really very, very unusual to see an interracial couple. And so it was kind of dangerous for my parents sometimes in London. My mother would always carry some pepper around with her in her pocket just in case she was attacked. And I remember that growing up. And I think that I understood something about what it felt like to straddle two cultures, because I've always felt you must love people whatever race they are. You don't love them in spite of their race, you love them because of their race, but you love all races. And it's a hard thing, especially in our current climate, to keep promoting. But I think that it's something that I grew up with, understanding something about the glory that came from Africa, because my father remembered that. And the glory that is England. There is a lot that is glorious in England too. And being able to fuse those two things and say, there's something valuable about difference. In my house, there were always wonderful African sculptures because my father was the maroon carver for Jamaica, and that was handed down since the 1700s. It was passed from father to son. And so we grow up with these. I don't even know how to explain how magnificent some of the artwork was in my house. But he also worked in a Brillo factory. And so he would go to work every day and make sure he left probably by about 6:30 in the morning, so I hardly ever saw him. And he would come back about 9 at night. But I would understand something about the glory of Africa that resided in our little house.
Lucinda, would you indulge us by reading a passage from Lady Moses? We're so familiar with your writing, but it would mean so much to hear you deliver it. Yeah, if you'd even set it up so the viewer knows where we are at this point.
I'd be delighted to read something. This is really at the very end of the book of Lady Moses, but it doesn't give anything away. And it's Louise Buttercup, Jacinta's mother. She's dying of cancer, and this is the last thing that she says to her daughter, Jacinta. And she wants to try to explain something about what it meant for her as a white woman to marry a black man. Her husband was from Africa. A few days before she dies, I am holding Louise's hand when she begins to speak. My name is Louise Buttercup Moses, she says. I have not been a good woman, but I have tried hard. I fell in love with a man called Simon Moses. People thought it was strange because he was a black man from Africa and I am a white woman from England. But it was not strange. We were like the moon and the night. We made each other brighter. Really, there was no difference between us. People are fools if they don't know what I mean. I never spent time looking for difference. I just made love to it. What else can you do? I think in that passage, one of the things that I really wanted to say was that sometimes difference does make us stronger, that there is a way to see it, that it is a productive and fruitful thing and not necessarily a divisive thing. But it takes a lot of courage, and I feel as though Louise Buttercup had that.
Absolutely. You've been listening to author Lucinda Roy. She is the author of Lady Moses, Hotel Alleluia, and several books of poetry. If you'd like to join us, please call us with your question. The number is 1-800-231-6359, and local viewers can call 703-978-1636. Charlotte, I see you have a question. Yeah.
Question about discipline and writing, and you do so many things. You paint, you write poetry, you write fiction, you're a mother, a wife. How do you fit it all in? New writers would need to know some idea about how to go about setting up their day or their schedule to accomplish all these things.
You know, I actually think it's almost impossible to fit everything in. So always, to some extent, you shortchange something. I wish that weren't true, but I think one of the things we have to do as women is say, we're not always going to be able to do everything. And we have to accept that in ourselves and still love ourselves. That's a tough thing to do. But I'm also very disciplined. I mean, I make loads of little notes and loads of plans. I'm going to get 27 things done today, and then if I get 14 done, I failed, but at least I've only failed by, you know, what's 27 or 14, for goodness sake? Whatever that is, 13. And I think that you really do need, as a writer, to have that kind of discipline and to be able to organize yourself. I think that most writers don't have that. I think that especially poets, and originally I was a poet, I came to that in a fairly undisciplined way. I never thought that I'd need to sit down and really plan out my day. I think the other thing you have to keep asking yourself as a writer is, does writing really make me happy? And if it doesn't, I shouldn't be doing it. And I know that this is something that most writers would disagree with me about, but I honestly do believe that it better enrich your life somehow. Otherwise, there's no way really to pass on a kind of joy. And that's something that I'm hoping I'm doing with my writing, and I would hope to do with my life also.
Who are your favorite authors? Who's inspired you, Lucinda?
The author I like the best of all is Shakespeare, I have to say. I'm also very fond of a woman called Bessie Head, who was a South African writer. She died not that long ago, and she wrote the most beautiful tender stories about people who were extremely poor in South Africa. And her best collection's called The Collector of Treasures. And it's about a woman who just collects very small things and makes of them a kind of world of happiness. And I really do believe that that's heroism, is trying to find a way within poverty to make something wonderful.
Thank you. Peggy, you've got a question.
Yeah, my question is kind of about setting of some of your books. I've just recently reread Hummingbirds, and I read Hotel Hallelujah. And Hummingbirds so much gives a picture of, to me, what slavery might have been like. And I see the hummingbirds, and I see the idea of flight, which was an idea in slavery. And then in Hotel Hallelujah, there's the African basis. Where did some of these setting ideas come from you? And I guess the question then is, how did you leave England? It's kind of a basic question from that as well.
Well, you know, I started out growing up in London, and I stayed there till I was 21. And then I went to teach in West Africa, and I taught there as a volunteer teacher. It was the same thing as the Peace Corps, and I taught there for 2 years. And then I went back later on. I also lived in, of course, Arkansas, and that is one of the settings for part of my novels, and also Virginia. But the most wonderful setting really for me was Africa in terms of its richness. My father always said to us, when you go to Africa, you will be going home. And even though he died when I was 5, my mother passed that on. You will be going home when you go to Africa. And I don't know how to explain what it was like to step into a setting that seemed so much to be a part of me. But that's what it was like going to Africa. I suddenly got large, if that makes sense. I suddenly seemed so much larger than I'd seen before. And the colors that I saw and the lights that I saw really seemed to tell me something about who the essence of me was. And I thought, yes, this is a wonderful place to be. In spite of there was a coup while I was there. There were all kinds of difficult things. But yet there was still this abiding beauty by which I could define myself. And I think that you see that influence very much in all of my novels. I cannot imagine writing a book that doesn't have some reference to Africa in it. I don't think that would happen. And some reference to England too, because I loved it there so much also.
We have a caller waiting to join the program. Mary, what's your question for Lucinda?
Having just finished Cry the Beloved Country, I was really struck by the similarities in the simplicity of the characters and the themes of redemption and forgiveness and family being the center. I wonder if that book influenced your writing at all.
My Beloved Country. Yeah,
Cry the
that
Beloved
influenced
Country,
you. Cry,
yes.
Cry My Beloved Country.
That's a good question. The question was really about whether or not Cry the Beloved Country influenced me, because it has so many themes of redemption and so on in it. And I actually think that it did. And I remember reading Cry the Beloved Country when I was a convent schoolgirl, if you can believe this, in London. And I was growing up, and I went to the library. And for some reason, of all the books I could have chosen, I think they had one book in there that in any way related to people of color. I honestly think that was the only book in the library that they had. And I didn't even know what Cry the Beloved Country was about. But I went, and I for some reason, I was really attracted to it. And I pulled it off of the shelf and I read it. And there's something, especially for a young reader, so noble about the sentiments in that book, that I thought, I really need to try and do something similar to that. But I think one of the books that influenced me even more was my father's book. And he has written a lot about race. And I came to his book when I was 11 years old. And of course, he'd been dead for 6 years by then. And so I came there looking for some answers to who I was. And I really think I found it in some of the things that he wrote too.
Will you help us transition into talking about your poetry by doing a reading from the Hummingbirds? And I guarantee you there's not going to be a dry eye in the house after you read this.
I wrote this poem for my son when I was going in for surgery, and I didn't know, what the outcome was going to be. And I thought, my goodness, I don't have anything that I can hand over to him that really is very small. I mean, I have large things like paintings and books, but I want something he could carry around in his pocket that would say he was greatly loved and that I will always be with him, even if I'm not with him physically. And it's called For My Son. When I die, whatever form I take will be close to song. When you part the grass ahead of you like hair, you'll feel the undertow of harmony pulling at the soles of your feet, and your journey will be made glad. When you call out in the complex dark, your voice will come back to you as mine, and dark will be made simple again. If you stand on the gentle mound of my grave and listen to the earth, you will wonder what death has to do with breathing. And if you dream of wings working a sweet hum from the air, my son, they will be mine, ready to carry you and your loved ones home, ready to carry you home.
I think we all need to swallow deeply and take a breath for a moment before we go on. But I believe Meredith has a question for you.
Yes, in your novels and also in the poem you just read, death is not necessarily a termination of a life, it's rather a continuation of a relationship and just in another era, in another time and place. In light of the recent attacks, September 11th, how has your perception of death and violence changed? And if it has, how would you have changed maybe the way you wrote your books and the way you wrote your poetry?
Oh, now
Wow.
that's really an interesting question. You know, I've been thinking a lot about that because I'm teaching advanced creative writing, fiction, and poetry right now at Virginia Tech. And one of the things I said to my students the other day was, because we watched the attack while it happened, we were in class at the time, and one of my students had a parent who was in the Pentagon, so it was a particularly difficult time. And I said to them afterwards, you know, you have a very special role as writers. There are things that you are going to have to try to explain, things you're going to have to illuminate now because everything is suddenly more complex. I don't know whether I would have changed things that I'd said in my novels or in my poetry, and the reason why I wouldn't is that always for me death was really close. I always felt as though it was my bedfellow, in a sense. That was partly because my father died when I was so young. It was partly because I lost some other people I loved greatly. It was partly because of all the things that happened in West Africa and Sierra Leone where there's been genocide. So all kinds of things like that made me understand the proximity of death and the necessity for somehow grasping hope from the ashes, just like the cross they found now at the World Trade Center, and they've raised it, and it's the only bars that don't seem to have been warped by the destruction. I think we honestly have a role as writers to try to salvage something, but we must never shortchange tragedy, we must never shortchange death. We must never make it easy and say, oh, it doesn't take long to overcome this, because the loneliness that comes through death is just incredibly profound. But I really believe, like the woman who's rising from the sea in my painting, that there is a way to salvage something. Those paintings I'm doing of the Middle Passage, of that journey that all the slaves took, are meant to show that there was something great in the spirits of those people that allowed them to survive. How are we here? It is a miracle. It cannot be. How are we sitting and talking to each other across race? And I don't feel your race personally right now. Maybe you feel mine, I don't know. But we're talking to each other across that chasm and still finding a way to connect. What a miracle that is. And somehow that has to be reflected in my work, I think.
In the passage that you just read, I could hear as you shared that so many voices in unison with you, almost echoing what you were sharing. It's just a powerful, powerful piece. Sabrina, you've got a question or comment?
Yeah, I was wondering how your role as a teacher of creative writing influences your own writing. Do they nurture each other?
They really do. I don't think that I could, sometimes I don't think I could write without teaching, and I couldn't teach without writing. And I really do believe that there's some truth to that. I don't think I would be a novelist without teaching fiction. I taught fiction before I'd written novels. And I'd written some short stories, but not novels. And I think that I learned something about the craft of fiction by struggling with students who were going through exactly the same kinds of struggles that I was. So instead of coming from a lofty height and saying, if only you were like me, I could say, if only we were like him. And I think that helped a lot. The students always give me all kinds of ideas, and they make me laugh so much. Sometimes that's the main thing that they do. They just make me laugh. As some of you know, I think some of my students, I try to talk the way they do so that I sound more American, as you can probably tell. And I was trying to do it a couple of years ago, and one of my students, Jeff Dean, said that I sounded like Margaret Thatcher in The Hood. And I thought that was such a brilliant description, and it always cheers me up. Every time I feel sad, I will think, Margaret Thatcher in The Hood, and it's just right.
Oh, I love it.
And I feel as though then they've given me a gift.
Lucinda, you've taken an active role in your role as professor of creative writing at Virginia Tech in really infusing technology, online courses, online book chats. Tell us how the technology has impacted your instruction and the students' experience.
I began working with technology, Lynn, actually, because lots of my students, especially some of my minority students, were not using the technology. And so I felt that it would be a nice way to bring them in. So we created a special class for students who were struggling, and for some who were doing extremely well. We put them together, and the class was called the Civil Rights Movement and Literature. It was several years ago, and most of it was online, but I could have lots of face-to-face contact with the students in tutorials. And it worked out so well because I could give a lot of attention to those students who needed it. So the technology was used in order to aid them fighting a problem that they'd really had, which was trying to be engaged in the literature itself. And they could see things visually, they could download videotapes, they could hear all kinds of audio clips, and it really became a successful experience. And best of all, we had the first person who checked out our guest page happened to be a freedom rider. Her name was Joan Browning, and she came and joined us for the entire class.
Does anybody have another question to jump in? Lynn?
I love my adopted state of Virginia, and you refer to Virginia as the Promised Land. Where does that come from?
I think, you know, it comes from my love of the place now. I've been in Virginia for 16 years, which is a long time for me. And every season I love it more than I loved it the past season, even now with the leaves changing. And there's a passage in my other novel, Hotel Hallelujah, where Ursuline, the main character, begins to understand something about the nature of the beauty, and she understands it by going to Virginia and then to North Carolina and seeing the fall leaves. And it's that kind of beauty that I feel as though I need to be able to capture if I can.
Unfortunately, we're almost out of time. If you'd like to learn more about Lucinda Roy, visit her website at www.lucindaroy.com. If you'd like to learn more about this program or the Fairfax Network, we can be reached at 1-800-233-3277. Lucinda, we can't thank you enough for joining us today. This has been wonderful.
I had a
having
wonderful
you.
time. I have to say thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
And the good news is we get to continue here in this studio, so anybody else want to jump in who hasn't had a chance to ask something? Chris, how about you?
Yes. Since you've been in the States, you've had a chance to observe the cultural diversity of the U.S. opposed to growing up in London, which was a different slant on cultural diversity. Could you comment or share with us some of your experience and exposures?
You know, one of the things that amazed me when I first came to America was that there were so many people of color here. I mean, there was in London where I grew up, but as soon as you left London, there really weren't many. And people always stared at me. I mean, I was just not used to being inconspicuous. But then I came here and I lived in Arkansas, of all places, and my mother was really worried because of Little Rock, and she kept saying, "Don't go near the rock, don't go near." But so I came here, and it was just a wonderful experience suddenly to see that 17% of the entire population was African American, and that the white people actually wanted to learn more about me. I mean, they were fascinated when I opened my mouth, and they'd say things like, "Do all the people in England look like you?" And I'd say, "Yes, the Queen does, but her tan isn't very visible on the TV screen." But